This video covers how to use LiveSplit, OBS, and Shotcut to make your speedrun videos look good, taking them from this to this. The first thing I'm going to cover is how to set up LiveSplit. This is made assuming you already know the basics of how the program works, but if you don't, there's a link to the LiveSplit tutorial in the description. So let's assume you just downloaded LiveSplit and are using the default layout. It's a good start, but you should be thinking about what kind of information you want to have available during your runs. Not only for yourself, but also for people watching the run. Having more information baked into your timer can help viewers who might not be familiar with the game or category understand how well you're doing. Before we get started, a disclaimer. This is my personal recommendation, and in the end, you can organize your splits however you like. It also goes without saying that you may want to change the information you put on your layout depending on what game you play. My highest recommendation is switching out the timer component for a detailed timer. Then, I would also suggest displaying your possible time save, run prediction, and sum of best segments. On that note, I recommend switching the comparison you use for your run prediction from current comparison to best segments. You can do this in the layout settings menu. Lastly, you can adjust the number of splits shown to remove those empty lines. Our layout is already looking a lot better, and you could go ahead and record your run like this. However, in the next step, you'll see how this can still be improved. Now we're going to switch to OBS. The first thing you want to do is check if all the recording parameters are correct. Are you recording audio from the right places? Is your monitor size correct? Most importantly, did you select the correct frame rate? Some games have rules or guidelines on this, but most of the time you'll be fine by setting it to the game's frame rate. In the vast majority of cases, you'll want either 30 or 60. Next up, you'll want to ask yourself what kind of capture method you're going to use. If your game runs in full screen, you can use display capture or game capture. Generally speaking, however, I would recommend using window capture instead. Let's use window capture for the game and also for the LiveSplit window. The first thing you have to ask yourself is whether you actually need detailed splits. If you're running an individual level, for example, you probably don't need to use LiveSplit beyond its most basic form. The only thing to keep in mind in this case is to make sure the timer is not covering anything important in the game. Let's switch to something that actually has full splits now. If you want an easy solution, you can put the game on one side and put the timer on the other side. This is totally fine, and recording like this means you don't have to do anything when it comes to actual video editing, other than maybe cropping the length of your recording. However, we can do better, and it's actually really easy. There are three main cases here. The first case is when there's a gap in the bottom left due to your splits not being tall enough. To get rid of it, you can just display a greater number of splits and adjust the layout size until it fits well. If you have a very large number of splits, you might be tempted to adjust your layout so that every split is visible at once, or at least most of them. I would recommend against doing this for a simple reason. If you shrink your splits that much, they're going to be hard to read for people watching your run on a smaller screen. The second case is when your initial setup is the same, but you don't have any more splits to add. The game window takes up the same amount of space in the scene, but I only have 10 splits to play with instead of 50. What you can do instead is add extra information to your layout to make it taller. You can also make the timer itself larger or just manually change the layout's shape and size. The third case is when your game is narrow enough that there is a black bar between your game and your splits. In this case, you can either make your splits wider or you can stick the splits right next to your game and resize the video in Shotcut, which we'll cover in the third part of this tutorial. One last case I want to cover is when you're recording a game that won't look good if you just use window capture. It could be a game you play through a browser, but for this example, I'll use Pokemon Crystal running on an emulator. Obviously, if there's a way to make your game more visible, like zooming in or resizing the window, go ahead and do that. But even if there isn't, OBS has a really easy way to handle this. You hold down the Alt key when resizing your source, and instead of resizing, it will crop instead. There's also a way to automatically adjust your OBS scene to the size of the window you want to capture. To do it, you can select Resize Output Source Size in the context menu you get after right-clicking a source preview. I would recommend against doing this. I'll explain why soon. Now you might wonder why you have to do all this setup in OBS rather than just handle everything in an editing program. The first reason is that OBS makes it much quicker and easier. You only do the work once here, whereas with an editing program, you generally have to put in some amount of work for every recording. Plus, your final product is going to take less time to render. The second reason is that you can also use this layout to stream, while an editing program doesn't allow you to work in real time. The third reason only applies to games you play in windowed mode. If you don't manage it in OBS, you're going to lose some pixels. This matters for the quality of your final recording, but it's especially important because of video compression. When you upload your runs to video sharing sites like YouTube, video compression will affect your quality more if your game footage is not upscaled. And zooming it in OBS allows you to get a higher definition than you would get by just cropping it in a desktop recording or using the automatic resize function. Now that we have a recording, we can deal with the actual editing portion. I'll be using Shotcut for this, but in theory you could use pretty much any video editing software. Again, this is not a Shotcut tutorial, but I'll still cover some basics. Once you open Shotcut, make sure Settings Video Mode is set to Automatic, then drag and drop your video file. This will create a new project with a video mode that matches the parameters of the file you just added to the project, which will most likely be 1920 by 1080 and 30 frames a second. If the screen is already completely covered by your video, there really isn't much you have to do. Just crop the length as needed and export. If a portion of the screen is black, though, you'll have to create a new video mode to export the video in its intended aspect ratio. The first step is going to be adding a new video track. Then, you can drag and drop a monochromatic background. The one I'm using here is a 1920 by 1080 JPEG of nothing but green pixels. Make sure it's on the video track below your main one. You don't actually need to do this, but it makes things easier for the next step. The second step is cropping your video. To do this, select your video in the timeline and navigate to the Filters tab. Then look for the Crop Source filter. You'll want to get the correct value, in this case left, as high as it can go, using the arrow keys or the mouse scroll wheel to fine-tune. This is why you have the green screen. It makes it much easier to see when you get far enough. Once you're done with that, you're gonna have to do a bit of math. You have to look at by how much you cropped and figure out how many pixels are left. So in this case, the screen width is 1920 pixels. We cropped on the left by 284, which means 1636 pixels are left. Once you have this number, navigate to Settings Video Mode, Custom, Add, and input your number as the new screen width. Make sure to also change the aspect ratio. Save your video mode under a good name, then exit the project with Ctrl-W. Once you're back to this screen, switch your video mode to the one you just created, and drag and drop your video file again. You'll notice it looks different. Apply the Crop Source filter again, and adjust the values until it's right. And that's it. You can then export the video in its new aspect ratio. If you have any questions about something that was shown in this tutorial, don't hesitate to ask in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for watching.